Today's scripture reading comes from Paul's letters to the Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. May I share a moment of joy with you. It was a magic moment 15 years ago, just a few days before Christmas. Camilla and I were wrapping presents. The lights on the tree were glowing. The Messiah was playing in the background. We were sipping on eggnog, maybe eggnog plus. The phone rang and I answered it. And it was the pastor nominating committee from Westminster saying they were extending a call to me to become the pastor of this church. It was a dream come true. And I was so choked up that for a few seconds I couldn't respond. There was silence. And finally somebody on the other end said, "Are you still there?" I was able to suppress the knot in my throat finally and was able to get some words out. You know what I said? I have no idea what I said. Somewhere in there I must have said, "Yes, I accept," but I can't remember a single word. But I got to come to the best congregation on earth. I can recall other moments of immense joy. When Camilla and I were married, our kids' graduations, holding a grandchild just minutes after birth. Can you recall a moment or two in your life that was just pure joy? The third Sunday of Advent is called Gaudete Sunday. Gaudete is the Latin word for joy, and it means rejoice. And in this morning's lectionary reading, the Apostle Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Those who think of Christianity as sullen and no nonsense definitely need an injection of joy. Those who think that faith is just a bunch of rules to follow and devoid of all laughter need a transfusion of jubilance. But I still feel the urge to challenge Paul's assertion. Rejoice? Definitely. We can point to wonderful moments in our lives when joy exploded in us like a geyser. But always? Whenever I hear anyone say always or never, I immediately want to take them on. Always? I can think of several examples that don't fit into your always. Paul, rejoice always? What about when you're told to pack up everything in your desk because you're no longer needed here? What about when the chemotherapy has socked you so hard that you can't even stand up? I can name some situations where rejoicing seems to be the furthest thing from somebody's mind. So what about Paul's declaration? Are his words merely the overly simplistic equivalent of keep your sunny side up. Worse is Paul calling on us to fake it. Put on a chirpy face to mask the anguish in our souls. In order to get a true sense of Paul's words, I think it helps to make a distinction between happiness and joy. To me, they are siblings, but not identical twins. They are very closely related, but they don't overlap, or they do overlap. We can be happy and joyful simultaneously, but we can also have joy in our soul even when life has slapped down our happiness. Happiness is prompted by the circumstances of our lives, while joy is tied to the temperament of our soul. Happiness is the result of good fortune. Joy is an aspect of our basic disposition. Happiness is celebrating the home team's victory, receiving an unexpected bonus, laughing at a joke, hitting a shot just the way you hoped to. Joy exudes from a deeper place within us. It's a component of our character. While happiness is dependent on something going right, joy is a feeling of well-being regardless of what's currently happening. Happiness is the elation we feel when life is good. Our fundamental relationships are positive. The kids are doing well. The parents aren't grouchy. Everyone's healthy. We're succeeding at school or work. Life's on the right path, and that makes us happy. Joy, on the other hand, can sustain a confident outlook even when the bottom drops out. Today's passage is a perfect example. When Paul penned these words to Christians living in Philippi, he had not just won the lottery. He had not just been given a lavish feast. He had not simply fallen in love. He was enduring harsh conditions in prison, robbed of his freedom, unable to fulfill his goal of spreading the good news, and living with the uncertainty of his fate. Paul was definitely not happy. Yet despite his miserable situation, Paul could say, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And then, as if he is anticipating the resistance he'll get by that, he doubles down. "Again, I say, rejoice." Paul's not delighted to be locked up. He's not happy about the idea that he's awaiting trial. But he expresses the serenity that's in his soul, his relationship with God, his knowledge that he is loved despite his failures, and his belief that nothing can separate him from God have combined to create in his inner being a feeling of shalom. Not merely peace, but a feeling of wholeness, a feeling of confidence that he is in harmony with the ways of God. Paul reveals all of this in this brief passage. After calling on his fellow believers to maintain this spirit of joy, he says, "Let your gentleness be evident to everyone." Now, gentleness is not a call to be wimpy, but to be kind, compassionate, empathetic, rather than harsh, insulting, and argumentative. Paul says, "Do not be anxious." Think about that. If anyone should be anxious, It would be someone sitting in prison, possibly facing death. Yet Paul counsels them not to be anxious. And then I think he may be revealing what has kept him from being distressed. He says, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. What kept Paul from going over the edge was prayer and a spirit of gratitude. Prayer is not simply talking to God, but being with God. Directing our attention away from worries and focusing on the one who was and who is to come. It's widening our focus from the small picture to the big picture, and doing it with a spirit of gratitude. If you do that, Paul says, then the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds. The book of Joy reveals the friendly jousting and wisdom sharing when the Dalai Lama was visited by Archbishop Desmond Tutu on his 80th birthday. The Dalai Lama, has been cut off from his people and living in exile for more than 50 years. Archbishop Desmond Tutu endured oppression and violence during the apartheid era in South Africa. Both men have been well acquainted with great struggle and deep sorrow. And yet, these are two of the most joyful people on the face of the earth. So what's their secret? Together, they pondered these questions. How do we embrace the reality of our lives, deny nothing, but transcend the pain and suffering that is inescapable? And how can we be joyful in a world where there is so much suffering? The first marker they laid down was to remember that suffering is inevitable, but how we respond to that suffering is our choice. Another gem of wisdom shared by Tutu was this: discovering joy does not save us from the inevitability of hardship and heartbreak. In fact, he says, we may cry more easily. But, he added, we will also laugh more easily. Perhaps, he says, we're just more alive as we discover more joy. We can have heartbreak, but not be broken. The Dalai Lama makes a helpful distinction between what he calls wise selfishness and foolish selfishness. Foolish selfishness is when you're so self-centered you think only of yourself. You evaluate every event as to how it affects you. You have no regard for its impact on other people. Wise selfishness, on the other hand, is aware that when you help other people, it brings joy back to you. You find personal happiness and fulfillment when you do something kind or generous for others. Think for a moment of those people whose child has died of cancer or drug addiction or a car accident. They suffered the most searing pain a person can experience. But rather than never crawling out of their dark hole of depression, they put their energy into raising awareness so that someone else might be spared from the pain they endure. Their focus did not erase the grief of loss, but it revived an element of joy by focusing on how they could help others. The Dalai Lama noted that one of the reasons joy is so elusive for so many people is because most people are searching for joy outside of themselves. He said, from money, power, a fancy car, or a big house. He said, most people never pay much attention to the ultimate source of joy, which is inside, not outside. If you think about it, some of our greatest problems are the result of what is within us. How do you view strangers? Do you see most people as threats or potential friends? Do you care about what's going on in the life of other people, or are you entirely self-focused? Do you approach life as a competition where there are winners and there are losers? Or do you believe that all of us are better off when we work together for the common good? Now, in some arenas like business or sports, competition can inspire innovation and excellence. However, if you see every facet of life as a competition between winners and losers, you will become frustrated, angry, and you will become lonely. Recent research by psychologist Sonia Lubomirsky points to 3 factors that have the greatest influence on increasing our joy. After studying thousands of people, she came up with these 3. Reframing our situation more positively, choosing to be kind and generous, focusing on gratitude. Well, without ever conducting any sophisticated scientific studies, the Apostle Paul came up with the same answer. He counseled others, first, reframe your situation positively. Paul had a choice. He could do what most people could do. He could lament his situation and increase his anxiety in the process. But he chose to rejoice because he knew that while he might be cut off from his friends, he would never be cut off from God. Then he encouraged the Philippians to exude kindness and generosity. Paul said, let your gentleness be evident to everyone. And lastly, he reminded them of the importance of nurturing a heart of gratitude. He called on them to give thanks, knowing that when we direct our thoughts to the things for which we are grateful, it can reduce the pain of loss. 4 years ago, the founding pastor of Trinity Presbyterian Church in Atlanta was laid to rest just a few days before Christmas. At his memorial service, his son Bryce said that they were going to miss many things about their father, but the thing they probably would miss the most was their dad's great sense of humor. He told the story that just a few days before he died, their sister was at the bedside of their father, and the 2 brothers were driving to the hospital. On the way, they discussed that they needed to talk to their dad about making some difficult decisions. They needed to talk about next steps, Dad. They agreed that Bryce would initiate this conversation, and the other brother said to him, but first, tell him that we love him. They arrived at the hospital, they went to his room, They gathered around his bed, and Bryce began to speak. Dad, we have some important things to talk about, but first we want to tell you how much we love you. Now, their dad had not spoken in a few days, but he began to stir, and they thought he was trying to speak. So they leaned over to hear him say, "Uh-oh." That's never a good sign. He maintained his wonderful sense of humor right up to the end. Even in the face of death, joy can shine through those who've nurtured the peace of God within their soul.